Episode 7. How do I live with wealth without being defined by it? Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fellen, and this is the Next Gen Mentor podcast. This series is for you if you've grown up around family wealth, not because you chose it, but because it was always there in the background. Something present, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and often not spoken about, at least not directly. At some point, the wealth in your family has to become something you have to relate to, not just understand, but learn to live with. Last time we spoke about independence, about how to begin building something that is only yours. In this session, we will stay close to that, but look at it from a slightly different angle. Why? Because even if you build something of your own, the wealth doesn't just disappear. It remains part of your environment, your ecosystem, and you have to work out how to live with it. Question 1. I'm worried that wealth could define who I am. The fact that you're saying that shows great maturity and awareness. Most people take a long time to get to the stage that you're now at. At first, wealth is simply, well, there. It's like the air you breathe. It provides access, options, possibilities. And as you were growing up, that probably felt entirely positive. The existential fear that the vast majority of people have about money just didn't exist. And you didn't have to think too much about money at all. Maybe whatever you wanted was simply made available to you, although I hope not. Maybe you didn't even need a college fund. In fact, I assume you didn't. But over time, something may have begun to shift inside you. Maybe you've already started to notice that wealth is not only something you have access to, it pervades all aspects of your life and influences how situations unfold around you, how people treat you, how they respond, what's offered, what is assumed. And this is where things become a little bit more subtle, more dangerous, and potentially more toxic. You see, wealth rarely defines you directly. It just shapes the entire context in which you operate. And if you're not careful, that context begins to shape you, and not for the better. I've seen this happen in various ways. Someone like you gets their first job. They're competent, well prepared. But because of their background, certain doors open more quickly, conversations happen more easily, and promotions appear earlier than they might otherwise have done. At first, it feels like swift progress, and in some ways it is. Maybe they're even grateful for the head start that they seem to have been given because of their wealth. But over time, a healthy question begins to sit at the back of their mind. Would this still be happening if the money weren't there? It's perhaps a question that we don't always ask out loud. Perhaps we fear the answer, but it is there. I want to give you an example. I once worked at a small bank where my neighbor in the office came from an extremely wealthy family. He had clearly been offered the job with no visible qualification for it apart from his family name. He had few responsibilities, no demands were made of him, and he spent most of the day playing computer games. I would often look over at him and ask myself whether he was happy. And that's a good question. Was he? Could he be? And this is where the distinction becomes important between access and identity. Access is what your wealth gives you. Identity is how you define yourself. The difficulty is that the two can become dangerously intertwined without you even noticing. You begin to move through situations where access is always present, and gradually it starts to feel normal, expected, given, an entitlement. The risk is therefore not that you rely on it once or twice, it's that you simply stop seeing the difference altogether, like my office neighbor. And when that happens, something else tends to follow. You begin to assume that the resulting outcomes are a reflection of you, when in reality, They may be simply a reflection of the environment around you, and that is not always easy to separate. Question two. So, should I avoid using any of the wealth's advantages? That is usually the first reaction, to move in the opposite direction, to try and remove wealth from the equation entirely. I've seen many people attempt that, actively avoiding opportunities, downplaying, or even hiding their background, trying to operate as if none of it exists. It rarely works particularly well when wealth, in your position, is not something external. It's part of the context you're in, part of your DNA, so to speak. Trying to deny its existence is as impossible as denying your own, and it often creates a different kind of distortion. You begin to make decisions not based on what is right, but based on what feels acceptable, and that can be just as limiting. So the question is not whether you use the advantage that wealth brings or not. It's how you relate to it, when it is relevant and when it is not. This is not something that is decided once and embeds itself. It changes across situations, across environments, and across stages of your life. And that is what makes it more difficult, because there is no fixed rule. There are moments in your life where access can accelerate understanding positively. And used in that way, it is of course valuable, not because it replaces effort, but because it informs it. And then there are other moments where access can distort things, where something comes a little too easily, where a decision is made quickly because the path is already open, or where you move forward without having to build the underlying judgment and gain the necessary experience. At the time, that is not always visible, but over time, the difference becomes a lot clearer. So part of living with wealth is learning to recognize those moments in order to pause and ask yourself, is this helping me understand something better? Or is it simply making things easier? And those are not the same. Question three, how does this show up in my everyday life? How should I recognize it? It usually occurs in small situations more than large ones. You meet people, introductions are made, and quite quickly something becomes apparent. And that is that the context you arrive with is not neutral. People have already formed an impression the moment your name is mentioned or before you've actually said very much. It can, of course, work in your favor. People may want to be associated with you. Conversations may be more open and opportunities may be offered or suggested more readily. But it also creates a certain expectation about who you are, about what you represent, and sadly, about what people can hope to gain from you. I've seen people respond to this in different ways. Some lean into it, and they accept the advantage of wealth, moving forward within it. That can work for a time, but it often leads to a kind of misalignment. And that is because the advantage of wealth has not been fully earned. It was assumed. Others resist it, trying to establish distance quickly, sometimes quite firmly. That can also create its own tension, because it's reacting to the perception rather than defining something about yourself independently. Neither approach is entirely stable. Both are shaped by the same thing, the expectation itself. A more useful approach tends to be a third one, a moderate one. You don't accept the advantage that your wealth implies immediately, but you don't reject it either. You let it sit and you define yourself over time through what you do and not what you say, and definitely not through whose child you are. It does take longer, of course, but it also tends to hold because it's built on something that becomes visible gradually: your judgment, your consistency, and the way you engage. Question four, what about professional situations? This is often where the tension becomes more pronounced because the stakes are clearer and the outcomes matter more directly. You start a job or consider one, then access is present. Doors open, introductions are made, and paths appear that might not be available otherwise. The question, again, is not whether you use them, but how. I've seen people from wealthy families move into senior positions very quickly because the opportunity was there, because it made sense, and because it was offered and not rejected. Sometimes that works, but sometimes something's missing. Not ability, at least not necessarily, not intelligence, but grounding. The sense that you've built your way into the position rather than just being helicoptered into it. That distinction is not always visible from the outside, but internally it matters because it affects how you operate once you're there. If something comes too early, too easily, you may find yourself adapting to the role, trying to fit in, rather than shaping it. Whereas if you arrive having built something, even if smaller, even less visible, you tend to relate to the role differently, with more clarity. That doesn't mean delaying everything, being less ambitious, or avoiding opportunities, but it does suggest something more measured, and that is that you step into things when you are able to contribute, not simply because they are available. Question 5. And socially? This is often less structured, but just as important. This is most probably the aspect that you've been exposed to up to this stage in your life, and you may well recognize what I'm about to touch on. You spend time with people, friends, peers, new relationships. And again, context is present, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just beneath the surface. You may notice that certain assumptions are made about your lifestyle, your choices, your character, and what matters to you. And here the risk is more subtle and yet just as dangerous. It's not about opportunity, it's about alignment. You may find yourself adjusting slightly to fit what is expected, or to avoid standing out, or to simplify interactions. That's not always a conscious decision and can happen gradually, but over time, it can lead to situations that feel slightly off. Not necessarily wrong, but definitely not entirely something where you're comfortable. So part of the solution is gaining the ability to notice these moments, spotting when you are adjusting, and asking yourself why you do it. Is it because of the situation? You want to make it easier? Or is it because it reflects who you are? Now, I stress this so much because the more consistently you align your behavior with what is actually you, the less you're shaped by what surrounds you. And over time, that becomes visible in you, not in statements you make, but in how you live. Question 6. So, what does it mean in practical terms to not be defined by wealth? It quite simply means getting to the stage where if you removed the wealth, your actions and their direction would still make sense. Not identical, perhaps, nor unaffected by it, but definitely coherent. That the decisions you make, the work you do, and the way you spend your time are not dependent on it being there. That's not always easy because wealth changes, increases the range of options available, but the underlying direction should still hold. And that's something you build gradually through choices, through the advantages that you accept, and through those you decline. In much the same way we discussed last time, except now the lens is slightly different. You're not only deciding what to build, you're going one step further, deciding how wealth fits into that. And that is not something that resolves quickly. It develops over time. And it's time where this begins to matter more, not in a single decision, but again in the accumulation of them. Once you start to move through different environments and meet different people, something becomes clearer. Wealth does not only change what is available to you, it changes how others view you, how they position you, and that is not always visible at first. You may notice, for example, that in certain conversations people defer to you, assuming a level of authority in you before you've actually earned it, or they expect a certain direction, not because of what you've done, but because of what they believe you represent. At first, that can feel useful. Things move more easily and decisions may be taken more seriously. But over time, it creates a subtle imbalance because you're no longer only responding to the situation itself, you're also responding to how you are perceived within it. And if that perception becomes a reference point, it will begin to shape your behavior. I've seen people adjust quite carefully in those moments. They speak slightly differently. They hold back in certain situations, or in some cases, they lean into the expectation more than they otherwise should. None is desirable because all are reactions, not decisions. So part of this is learning to notice when you are reacting and when you are acting. It sounds a small distinction, I grant you, but it is an important one. Question 7. How do I stay grounded in situations where wealth is so clearly present? Now, this is usually less about what you say and more about how you orient yourself. When you enter a situation where wealth is visible, whether that's a business meeting, a social environment, or even within your own family, there's often a shift in how things are framed. Conversations may move more quickly to outcomes. Expectations may be higher, or at least more immediate. The temptation is to match that pace, to respond in the same way, to use the same vocabulary, to move quickly. But I've found that a slight pause can be quite valuable. Not hesitation, of course, but a moment to recenter and to ask yourself, what is actually being talked about here? And what is my role in it? Not the role that is assumed, but the one that makes sense for you. That pause is often enough to prevent you from being pulled into something prematurely. It also allows you to contribute more deliberately. The reason is that you're no longer reacting to the momentum of the situation, but you are choosing how to engage with it. And over time, that is noticeable. People begin to understand that your responses are considered, not automatic, and that builds a different kind of trust. Question 8. I sometimes find that wealth creates distance between me and others. Absolutely. This is something that is not always spoken about directly, but it is often present. Many find that in certain environments there is a gap, not necessarily in conversation, but in experience. People around you may have taken different paths, grown up in different environments, built things differently, and faced constraints that you have not. And that can create a sense of distance, even if the relationship itself is strong. It's almost as if they could consider it your fault that you've grown up in your environment, and they in theirs, and that you're somehow guilty of something. That can feel hugely unfair, and you will be tempted to do one of two things. One of which is to minimize the difference between you, to avoid acknowledging it, or to try and level the situation. The other is to overcompensate, to explain, to justify, to make the difference explicit. Neither tends to work well because both focus on the difference itself. A far more stable approach is to stay with the shared ground. What are we building? What are we working towards? What do we value in this situation? Those things tend to hold more weight over time because they're not dependent on background. They're visible through behavior. Question 8. How do I handle situations where wealth gives me an advantage? This is where the judgment that you develop over time becomes more precise, because advantage is not always obvious in the moment. It may appear as an opportunity. And the question is not whether you accept it, but how you do so. If you accept it without reflection, you may move forward quickly, but without fully understanding the position you're in. If, on the other hand, you reject it entirely, you may miss something that could have been useful. So again, it comes back to a pause. What does this give me? And what does it bypass? Does it help me build something? Or does it replace part of that process? There is no fixed answer, but asking the question tends to clarify the situation. I've seen people use access well and positively, not as a shortcut, but as a way to learn more quickly. They enter conversations not to secure an outcome, but to understand how things work. They use proximity to observe, to ask, and to test, and then they step back and build. And that sequence matters because it keeps development intact, whereas using access only to move forward can leave gaps. Question 9. What happens over time if I get this balance right? If you get it right, it tends to create something that's not immediately obvious, and that is consistency. Not in the sense of doing the same thing repeatedly, but consistency in how you approach situations. People notice patterns. A pattern where you engage where it makes sense and you step back where it does not. You use what is available to you, but you are not driven by it. And that creates a certain stability because others begin to understand how you operate. You're not defined by the environment, but you're also not disconnected from it. You move within it deliberately. And that is what allows you to build something that holds. And what if I get it wrong? This will happen, believe me. There will be moments where you rely on access more than you had intended to or was healthy, or where you step into something too quickly, or where you misread a situation. That's just part of the process. What tends to matter is how you respond afterwards. Do you notice it? Do you adjust? Or do you continue in the same direction without questioning it? The earlier you recognize those moments, the easier they are to correct. Left for too long, they tend to become patterns, and patterns are obviously more difficult to change. So part of this maintaining a certain awareness is important, not constantly, but regularly, checking in with how you're making decisions, what's influencing them, and whether they still align with what you're trying to build. Question 11. How do I know if I'm being defined by wealth without realizing it? Now, this is not always obvious, since it rarely appears as a clear shift. More often, it shows up in small ways again. Decisions that become easier over time without you fully understanding why. Paths that feel natural but have not been tested. Situations where you move forward without needing to question much. At first, that can feel like progress, but over time, it creates dependency because your movement is no longer entirely based on your own judgment. It is supported by the environment of wealth, and that support can be difficult to see from the inside. One way to test this is quite simple. Take a decision and ask yourself, would I still make this choice if none of this were present? Not as a theoretical exercise, but in all seriousness. If the answer is yes, then the direction likely holds. If the answer is uncertain, it may be worth taking a closer look, not to change it immediately, but at least to understand it better. Clarity in those moments tends to prevent larger adjustments later, and over time, that is what allows you to stay aligned, so that what you build makes sense both with wealth and without it. That is the balance, and it is something that develops, not through a single decision, but through how you operate repeatedly. Where this leaves you is not with a rule, but with a way of thinking. Wealth in your position is not something you need to solve, apologize for, or feel ashamed about. It's something you manage repeatedly for good, and often without drawing attention to it. You will move through situations where wealth is clearly present, and others where it is barely visible. Moments where it helps and moments where it actually complicates things. What matters is therefore not that you get every decision right, you won't. What matters is that you remain aware of it and how it is influencing you. And that keeps you returning to something quite simple. What are you actually building? Because if that remains clear in your mind's eye, then wealth becomes something you use, a tool, not something that uses you. Over time, this creates a different kind of stability, not because the environment changes, but because your relationship to it becomes more defined. You're no longer adjusting constantly, you are choosing. And that is usually enough, if not to remove the influence of wealth entirely, but definitely to keep it in proportion, so that it remains part of your life, but not the center of it. And that, in many ways, is the balance you're aiming for. Not perfect by any means, but certainly deliberate and held over time. Now, before we close this session, let me summarize. Living with wealth without being defined by it is not about distance. And it's definitely not about denial. It's about proportion, understanding when it is relevant and when it is not, and being able to move between these two states without losing your sense of direction. You see, over time, that's what becomes visible. Not what you say about wealth, but how you handle it on a regular basis and consistently. So for now, let's just keep your focus on a few things. And here are a few tips. First of all, what I think you should do. First of all, take a moment before using access. Ask what it adds and what it replaces. Build something that would still make sense without the wealth. Use proximity to learn, not just to move forward. Stay away. Things to do. Take a moment before using access. Ask what it adds and what it replaces. Number two, build something that would still make sense without the wealth. Number three, use proximity to learn, not just to move forward. Number four, stay aware of how others position you without reacting to it immediately. Number five, define your role through what you do, not what is assumed. And here are some things to avoid. Number one, relying on ease without questioning it. Number two, rejecting opportunities simply to prove independence. Number three, adapting too quickly to expectations around you. Number four, allowing perception to shape your behavior. And number five, moving forward without testing your own judgment. Now, don't worry, none of this needs to be perfect. It won't be. But if you keep returning to the same question, does this still make sense without the wealth? Then you'll stay close enough to your own direction. And that was this session, where we looked at how to live with wealth without being defined by it. In the next session, we will move further into capability, into how judgment is formed and how it begins to hold under pressure. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.